But then at the same time, and I think this is the often overlooked component, I think it has to do way more also with soft skills and with especially personal competences, and on the second basis also social competences.
This episode is brought to you by WHU, the Otto Beisheim School of Management. WHU is reshaping the way students learn about business, management, finance, and entrepreneurship through its innovative programs and partnerships in Germany and across the globe. To learn more about this globally ranked university, visit whu.edu today.
Hi folks, Dries here. Welcome to the newest episode of the Most Awesome Founder podcast. Today we do something slightly different. Whereas we normally discuss with founders about their entrepreneurial success stories, we focus this time on an epic failure story. In this episode, I talk with Kilian Karrasch. In 2016, during his undergraduate studies, Kilian co-founded Connme, a social travel platform. However, in 2019, after 3 years of hard work and self-funding, he and his co-founders decided to terminate the startup. In this episode, you will hear the painful story of why Connme did not succeed. It's a story about how unexpected events forced the founders to change course and how lack of success challenged the friendship that went back to kindergarten times. I hope you will enjoy the show.
Coming to you from WHU on the banks of the Rhine River in beautiful Volendar, Germany. This is the best and most awesome founder podcast. A show about entrepreneurs, innovators, advisors, and educators, and the stories that make them who they are today.
Kilian, welcome and great to have you here today on the Most Awesome Founder podcast. And as announced, today we will apply a slightly different approach. So we will actually focus on a failure story instead of a success story. So first of all, thank you for being willing to share some information on one of your failure stories. Now, before we dive into the failure story, it would actually be great if you can do some personal storytelling. So on your own personal backgrounds, can you share a bit where you're coming from? What kind of person we have today on the podcast?
Definitely. First of all, Dries, thanks for having me. It's great to be back at the alma mater, although right now just on screen. I grew up in Germany till the age of 16. That was the first time when I moved to southern France because part of my family are from southern France, and so I spent a school year abroad there. And that was really the first time that I hugely fell in love with like a very cultured and culturally rich environment, because I went to an international school there, had exposure to a lot of different people. And that kind of forged the transition and the trajectory that I ultimately also embarked on, and that we also will touch upon later as part of the failure story that you alluded to. But so after that, I came back, did my bachelor's did a dual study program actually for my bachelor's. And during that time, really had this, let's say, was fortunate to be able to travel quite a bit, met a lot of people internationally. So I had 2 semesters abroad as part of the program, had a work stay abroad. So really was able to go into different cultures. And during that time, also just like on weekends and so on, travel a lot with my friends. And that was precisely that moment in time when I went to Korea for my semester abroad, where I started realizing the difference it made to have someone there, whether it's a friend, whether it's a friend of a friend in that particular country, because that person can just show you a country way differently. Just to give an example, right? Like after the 3rd day, I was basically invited to a family gathering in Korea, something where in hindsight, people told me, wow, like I've lived in the country for 10 years and no one had invited me yet. And yet I had the chance and the opportunity to experience such things. And there are many more of these little experiences that ultimately made traveling so much different. And so when I came back, and that was actually, funnily enough, I was just cooking, standing in the kitchen, like the way sometimes, let's say, epiphanies happen, right? Because in the back of my mind, I was always like, what's the difference between me just flying to a country and, let's say, often feeling not fully satisfied with the way I experienced the country, and then in these kind of experiences that I made back then. And it just hit me that really, like, the connecting factor was ultimately knowing people that are very like-minded. And that laid the foundation, what was ultimately to become Connme, which is the business we will talk about later. Which we then bootstrapped throughout the bachelors. After the bachelors, where I also became part of a business transformation at Hugo Boss, did a lot of, let's say, customer-focused transformation there. And then later on, that all prompted me, or the failures prompted me to then, let's say, seek for another path, go to WHU, expand my network, and ultimately, down the line led right now also to the funding of my current company.
Okay, yeah, and we will also come back to that at the end. But so, as you already indicated, I want to talk with you a bit about this endeavor you did with Connme, which was a kind of social travel platform, as I understood it, as it's still announced on LinkedIn even today, a localized travel experience, which you founded in August 2016.
Yes.
So can you explain a bit more about exactly what kind of pain points you wanted to solve with this travel app that you created?
Yes, definitely. So we started from our personal experience, right? And so we said, hey, there must be an easier way to find people that our friends know abroad. Because what we would do is we would spend partially hours on Facebook, for instance, going through friend lists and checking, okay, my close friend X knows these people. And that person happens to be in Hong Kong or in Denmark or wherever it is. And that was ultimately, the experience was worth it, but the process to get there was a huge pain. So at least to the people like in my surroundings that traveled in the same way. And so we said, hey, there should be an easier way, because like if you just know the indirect connections through Facebook, we can just scrape it. You can say, hey, I want to go to Denmark or to whatever place, or to Tunisia, see if there's anyone in your extended circle of influence, and then just, let's say, give you the solution. That was the basic idea. Now, what happened is that 3 months into testing the idea, so we went out and like tested it, like spoke to over 200 people, also like age-wise 20 to 25, to also inquire how they traveled, what they liked, what they disliked, and especially always focusing on this, let's say, social component, becoming part of a new culture, becoming part of, let's say, the really local communities. And what happened during that time is that suddenly Facebook closed their API.
Yes. That was related to the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
Exactly.
Okay.
So having, let's say, already developed a solution, having had the mock-ups and so on, we then realized, okay, that solution is no longer feasible. So we were basically at the point where we had to decide, either we abandon this idea, or we, let's say, go all in and create our own network, which we knew is much harder. But we're so convinced of the idea that we ultimately said, hey, even if it only turns out to be, let's say, a small thing and all of our friends use it, we might already still, let's say, at least solve our own pain points.
Yeah. Before we go on, because you were saying before, look, I was cooking my dinner and suddenly I had this epiphany for this idea, and I wanted to make it happen. Now, I'm also often cooking, and I might also sometimes have nice ideas when I'm cooking, but that does not necessarily mean that I suddenly decide to start a startup. You can have great ideas, but
that's true.
Still then making the decision, I will really go for it and create a startup during my undergraduate studies seems to be a big step. can you explain a bit why you were so driven to really make this happen, to not just think about this great idea during cooking, but really start it as a startup?
That's a good question. I think what comes to play here is a bit of my background story as well. I grew up with my father being self-employed and having his own company. And so from the early age on, I really saw him constantly, let's say, working and constantly, let's say, also and having fun in the process. And it was for me not necessarily at that point in time when I had the idea, it wasn't really about, let's say, I have to found a company. It was more about this intrinsic motivation to really solve that pain point, and whether it would become a startup, whether it would just become any type of solution, was, to be fair, at that particular point in time, secondary to me.
Okay.
Because what really drove me is to first of all solve my own pain point and the pain point of our friends, and I just wanted to find a solution for that. And so in a way, I got creative on how that could be, and the process just turned out to be a lot of fun. Talking to a lot of friends, really understanding also how that works, because that's been something I have had absolutely no idea about. Like I literally, and I'm kind of ashamed or almost to like say that, but I literally typed into Google how to start a startup and then like read through different blogs or how to launch a product, right?
Yeah.
And obviously there's lots of stuff, lots of recommendations on Google. Everyone says different things. And I just basically followed a bit of the red thread of things that I found online, like doing mockups. I had no idea what a mockup is and so on and so forth. Yeah. But it was just like, okay, it seems to be that a lot of people recommend that. So let's just do this. Let's just do user testing and these kind of things. Yeah. Which happened to be sometimes a good suggestion, but oftentimes, I mean, they also tell you to do 50 things at the same time, which is more distracting than actually, let's say, beneficial.
Yeah. And as I understand it, you also had some co-founders. Were they immediately also involved, or did you first start alone and then gradually involve them? How did that go?
So I had the idea first on my own, but then a kindergarten friend of mine, I told him about it, and he was like, this is so cool. Like, I'm in, kind of thing, like without even really being or without really having, let's say, discussed it further. We was just like, yeah, that's so cool, I want to like join, I want to like make that happen. And which, to be fair, we can touch upon it also later, is also something that's also, let's say, resulted later on in problems. Like finding the right co-founding partner, I think, is also a big learning when it comes to, do you want to do it together with very close friends or not? I think there's good arguments for and against it. Yeah. But so we're mostly the two of us first for the first 3-4 months. And then I did my semester, or then I did a work stint abroad in New York. And at the same time, my co-founder, or then who became my co-founder, the good friend of mine, he did a semester abroad in Madrid. And he just basically went on all the parties, said like, hey, yeah, we have this cool idea. And then there happened to be a tech guy, because we needed a CTO, who just said, hey, cool, I'm in. Like, I like that idea. And so we're like, okay, I guess, I mean, if he's so motivated, let's just do it. And just was like a random party somewhere in Madrid that happened to like get us this other person on board, which, to be fair, I mean, in hindsight, vetting people and so on and so forth, I mean, there's also lots of things we could have done better and differently, but yeah, that's how it went.
Yeah. So let's say it in a nice way, the co-founder team was created quite organically.
Yes.
Great. Okay, and then we come back to the story indeed, because you were saying, okay, we were like in for 3-4 months. Suddenly Facebook closed down their API, which actually destroyed our initial idea of leveraging the Facebook network to establish connections, which actually implied that you had to start creating your own network.
Right.
So how did you do that?
Yeah, so essentially what we did at first was, so there were two components to it. The first component was like, we said, okay, let's leverage our own friendship circle, because lots of people travel that way. So we just, like, the same people that we had asked for their opinion on whether or not this is an actual pain point, In brackets, it turns out it was not enough of a pain point for people to ultimately use the solution. But these people said, okay, if we can develop a solution for them, and if all of our, let's say, if all of us invites our closest 5 friends, and these friends do the same, we're rapidly gonna have a lot of people on there. And the only thing we obviously didn't factor in is that in such a model, you need to probably start locally and not globally immediately, because eventually it doesn't help you if you have, I don't know how many tens of or hundreds of thousands of cities in the world, and the chances of you finding someone, even if there's 5,000 people on the platform, being in precisely that little village you go to around the world are super slim.
Yeah.
And then the second problem being obviously that there is, let's say, the travel is not something that happens every weekend. Back at the time it did a bit, but not like for people that then graduate, that have jobs and so on and so forth. So let's say the hook factor of the application, so that people open it often enough and so on and so forth, was really not given. It's like a thing you open once or twice a year maybe, and so people definitely don't keep that type of application on their phone. But yeah, this is something that we ultimately also had to learn. But back at the time, we didn't really factor that in. We just focused on, let's ask our friends to invite 5 people each, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, and so the idea was, I can register on the platform, and then when I travel to somewhere, I can find somebody that can kind of welcome me in that particular city. And at the same time, I'm also willing to welcome people in my own city. So I'm both a kind of user of the platform, but also a producer.
Yeah.
Something like that.
And with the one, let's say, distinction that, because we saw also quite a few people use, for instance, couch surfing to get in touch with local people. But what everyone told us is that A, they don't feel secure, because especially girls, and B, they often don't really, let's say, sync or feel like they're on the same wavelength with these people. And so we said, hey, people surround them. Like if you go to a party, right, and a good friend of yours introduces you to someone else, like if that person is also a good friend of your friend, chances are that at least to a certain degree, you have similarities. You have, let's say, commonalities that you can then build on. And that gives you that instant connection that is super helpful in, let's say, forging stronger bonds, and actually also creating some sort of interest in the other person. And we wanted to leverage that concept to say, hey, the same is going to work for you traveling abroad. And then later, when we realized is, hey, not everyone knows people around the globe, obviously. So what we added on top is a layer of sort of personality test.
Okay.
So like this typical MBTI test that gives you, that tells you, hey, you're such and such type of person. We replicated the algorithm, but twisted in a way that's like a fun questionnaire for travel. So that would indicate your travel preference, whether you're and that would also then, let's say, give you in a second step. The plan was to give you recommendations on particular activities, because not everyone might enjoy going to the Colosseum or doing a mountain hike or going to that particular cafe. So again, we wanted to base all these recommendations to make them way more tailored based on your personality type, or travel type, as we called it.
Yeah. Okay, so you did a number of iterations based on the learnings that were emerging as you were creating.
Exactly.
Now, I also read that in the end, you became a kind of bootstrapped company with 6 employees.
Yeah.
Were these people all doing it on the side, or were there really people that were fully committed to the startup?
Both. So the 3 co-founders did it, but so we did it alongside our day jobs, which I think is also, let's say, in hindsight, was a big mistake. Because either you're fully committed or you're not. I mean, in the initial ideation stage, you can obviously, let's say, do it along your job, but once you're committed to it, you should go. And late, like at the very end, for the last half a year, I did this full time as well, because I was still hoping that I could turn like things around and make the company grow enough, which obviously didn't materialize in the end. But yeah, so we were doing it part-time, and then we had some full-time interns, and hired also some freelancers that were also working on it full-time.
Yeah.
And the way we so basically we used our salaries that we were earning on our jobs to, let's say, pay the salaries of the other people.
Okay. Yeah. So you kind of self-funded your startup.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Which, to be fair, I think for a platform business is not necessarily, especially such a consumer-driven platform business, not really a good way to go. No. Because it slows you down, and you have to, especially if you have to build such a big network, you have to really move fast. And being limited by those financial resources, as well as by simply, not having enough commitment and enough manpower on board, just was a cardinal mistake, so to speak, that afterwards also made it impossible to, even once we reached, let's say, a particular state with the app and with the user base, made it impossible to get funding, because investors were like, yeah, but you guys are way too slow.
No. But at the starting point, were you considering external funding, or was it simply something?
I didn't even know it existed, to be fair.
Okay. Okay. So that didn't come up in your first Google search on how to do a startup, that you could ask people for external funding. Okay. That's bad luck, I would say. Good. Now, as you indicated, so traction remains rather limited. I saw, for instance, on the LinkedIn page, there were 26 followers, which is not the biggest traction.
We didn't push LinkedIn, but yeah, essentially, we just put it on LinkedIn to be able to put a proper logo on like in our profiles. Like we mostly shared it via social media, via like Instagram / back at the time actually Facebook.
No.
But yeah. We had a couple thousand followers, and like it wasn't much.
Yeah, but so what kind of stuff did you try to kind of push traction forward?
Mm-hmm. So there are actually a number of initiatives. Like, first of all, my co-founder decided to pursue a master's degree in the US at Holt International Business School, precisely for the reason that was, let's say, one of the most diverse and international schools. And he just wanted to, let's say, push the app through his exposure to all these different students that would then go back to their home country and hopefully spread it. So that was one way. And then obviously connected to that, going to fairs, let's say creating stickers, bombarding the entire school with stickers and so on and so forth. So a bit of guerrilla marketing.
Yeah.
And then what we realized is that, coming back to this point of that, we wanted to have actual content on the platform to make it more enticing to people to also browse, to, let's say, stay longer on the platform, to be inspired. We then wanted to cooperate with travel bloggers under the premise that we would basically help them to tailor their content to particular personality types. So we would basically give them, let's say, a deeper understanding of their readers, and thus help them to make their recommendations way more attuned and way more personalized to the reader base, and in exchange for basically adding free content, and that we would then use their blog, so to speak, to get further people on board. So those were the main ideas that we pursued. Or in addition to the obvious word of mouth that I described initially. And what we also tried, to be fair, and I spent quite a bit of time on that, is create, because back at the time I came across a, like, say, internet marketing guru, and he was all talking about copywriting and like creating, let's say, self-liquidating offers and so on and so forth. And so I set up an online funnel, a marketing funnel, with an online video, and then basically to pitch the idea to people and to convince them to give us, I think back at the time it was $10 or so for like the premium membership one time, kind of like do a crowdfunding, but through online marketing to get people on board. But yeah, that didn't really turn out because like acquisition costs were way higher than what we would get in. So we rapidly turned that off again. But that was an interesting experience. I think it taught me a lot about as well about the entire copywriting and like intermarketing.
Because was there a clear monetization strategy from the beginning? Like, how did you in the end want to make money with it, or was that
not really? That was also like a part we first wanted to focus on solving the problem, and then we realized, hey, in order to fuel the growth, we would actually need to make money with this. And so the obvious choice was, hey, let's do a subscription model. Let's do like a freemium model, so to speak. But that was rather coming on top. We would then, let's say, have as exclusives invite to particular organized events and so on and so forth. But in the end, we never really, let's say, even came to the point where we created that premium offering, because we realized there is not enough demand to actually, let's say, get people to pay for it. Because what we like, coming back to what we talked about originally, it was really about that people said it was a cool idea. Like it was this typical vitamin that everyone said, yeah, it's cool, like I would want to use it, but it wasn't a true pain point because people could still go travel, they could still make good experiences and so on and so forth. So it wasn't, in the end, in hindsight, strong enough of a pain point to really also prompt users, especially a target group that has, let's say, that is restricted in their budget because they're studying mostly. To then pay for a service that they can maybe use 4 times a year maybe.
Clear. Now, as you mentioned, so you tried several things to kind of increase the traction on your platform. It did not really work out. How did that influence kind of the relationship between the three of you? Did it?
Excellent question. Because I think in hindsight, what really, let's say, broke the startup was ultimately a co-founder conflict.
Okay.
But to give a bit of background on that, so essentially, after a year of working full time, we were kind of like at this point where we said, okay, someone has to focus on this full time, otherwise it's not going to succeed because we're not making fast enough progress. And so, being in that position, I said, okay, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to go to Berlin. I'm going to focus on this full time.
Okay.
And so I'm going to dedicate my entire work power or manpower into this. And the other 2 co-founders stayed in their jobs for now, but had the commitment that they would, let's say, chip in the money to cover the costs of the insurance and so on and so forth. So that was the background. What then happened is, I think 2-3 months down the line, one of the co-founders decided to get married, which is beautiful, right? As a friend, I was super proud. But then as a co-founding partner, he suddenly told me, hey, right now I have different commitments. I need the money for something else because I'm building a relationship, which again, from a friendship perspective, 100% agree. And I was super happy for him. From a co-founder perspective, I felt very betrayed. And so also then, let's say, first of all, being in this position, having the 2 hats, and then let's say communicating, you can imagine it can be very rough if you approach a person with a 1 hat. Right now I'm speaking to you as a co-founder. Basically trying to explain in a nice way that you feel betrayed, and then the person of taking it as from a friendship perspective. And so that created a lot of conflict. That ultimately we faced a situation where we said, okay, the business is not really going anywhere. We're right now about to ruin our friendship. We knew each other from kindergarten. So back at the time was like over 20 years. And so that was really the point where we had to decide, okay, either it's the business or it's the friendship. And given that the friendship was not really, given that the business was not really going anywhere, we said, okay, let's stop here. It was a great experience. We learned a ton in the process. But in the setup right now, it doesn't really make sense anymore. And doing it alone by myself, without funding, without anything, also didn't really, let's say, look promising enough. Especially then I reached out to a couple of investors and they told us, hey, you guys are being you were too slow, you don't have enough traction, and so on and so forth, which was really the point where I said, okay, I understand, like this is where it's supposed to stop.
Yeah.
Which was a really tough situation to be in, because I just like quit my job 6 months earlier.
Yeah.
But I think these situations also make you grow a ton, because it gave me then a lot of time to reflect upon the entire journey, understand the tens and hundreds of mistakes I made when it comes to both being a leader, when it comes to understanding pain points, as I mentioned, when it comes to funding and so much more, product and marketing and so on. And so I'm still very grateful for the journey, and I would, in hindsight, still like do the same. I mean, I would do a ton of things differently, but I think the actual first step of going out there, pursuing a passion, and try to solve a pain point for people, I think that's a beautiful thing, and ultimately also prompted me to right now start over again, right, with all the learnings in hindsight or in mind.
Because if you would go back and you would like have the option, like say, okay, maybe I should, I don't know, join first an incubator program or follow a startup workshop or boot camp, whatever, instead of immediately kicking off, would you simply do the same again? Or would you think actually it makes sense to first kind of get some basic knowledge from somebody else? Or do you think that that simply cannot kind of substitute the real life experience that you need to have?
I think what helps a ton, or what would have helped a ton, would have been, you might call it angel investor, you might call it mentor, someone experienced who's been there.
Yeah.
Because I think, I mean, there's two ways, right? Like either you pick up some stuff in school, as I think a lot of undergraduates and graduates do at WHU, or at the university that I was at, there like no one even talked about startups. Like there was absolutely nothing to build on and no one to reach out to.
Yeah.
And I think this is also what caused, let's say, a lot of the early mistakes that were totally avoidable. But then ultimately, I think there's, let's say, the blueprint of the things you need to do. And then there's execute. And there's so many, let's say, challenges and that you have to overcome, that ultimately every founder journey then looks very differently. And I think these learnings on how to handle that, and especially also, let's say, the personal development that comes with it, the resilience you need, the motivation, the self-awareness, the tolerance for uncertainty, and this risk-loving mentality, all these things I think you really also develop in the process. I think internships can help, work experience can help, university can help, but I think ultimately you really know, or you really learn it in the process.
Yeah. I'm quite intrigued that you say it would be great to have somebody like an angel investor or a mentor, which seems very reasonable, but in the end, you didn't do it. So why during this trajectory did you not consider, oh, why should I not try to approach some people that can maybe help me, giving me advice? Again, was this just because you simply didn't realize that other people were doing this, or was there another reason to not do it? Maybe you were afraid that you would give away secrets or something like that?
So I think it really took a while to understand that we're moving slow, because if you haven't heard about how fast, like if you never heard about any startups being developed in the first place, if you have no idea that you could go from 0 to 10,000 or 100,000 users within, I don't know, 6 months partially, then you're like, okay, we're going at a speed, and it's just like a very subjective assessment of is it going good or is it not going good? I think that was the first part. And then the second part is that at some point I really realized that when I quit my job and I was like, okay, things have to go somewhere. This is when I realized, hey, in-person contact is super important. Like the way I tried to bridge it before is, for instance, by purchasing online courses from accomplished entrepreneurs, because I thought, hey, at least these guys have been there. They can let's say give me hints and tips on how to overcome lots of these barriers, which partially it did. It definitely helped me to understand way more how to build a startup. But then again, when it comes to specific questions, they can't answer you because there's like no Q&A. There's no one whom you can really tell the particular situation you are in, and can reach out to. And I had one mentor, let's say, just for my private life, who owned a company in Stuttgart, a big IT company. And he just, let's say, gave us advice on the technical side and not so much, let's say, on the founding side. So there's been people, but I think overall, more passive people. And I think a more active involvement, and this is why I mentioned angel investors, is that because often they tend to be that way, would have been way more helpful.
No, okay. Maybe to briefly reflect a bit about what was the impact of deciding to stop the startup on you personally. Yeah, so I try to imagine you some years ago sitting in Berlin in an apartment, having quit a job 6 months earlier, and now having made this decision, okay, we need to stop this.
I was like, at first I was like devastated.
Yeah.
But at the same time, also a bit relieved, to be fair, because it's always also like a lot of pressure off the shoulders. Because if you then have suddenly, I mean, we had interns and we had like some developers outsourced that were working on it full time. And I mean, I had to communicate to these people. Some of them were doing the end of graduation project. And I basically had to tell them, hey guys, like this is not going forward. I'm sorry, but like you have to finish your end of graduation project somewhere else. Which also had like obviously negative impact on them. But so it was not only, let's say, for myself, but also hard from a leader perspective in that small context. And so I really started questioning whether you can ever succeed in a startup. And then reflecting back on, let's say, the corporate perspective that I also had, where this transformation and innovation project, where we basically wanted to completely revamp an entire business model to make it fit for a different customer group, also didn't succeed.
Because that was after you had finished
my bachelor's,
Connme.
exactly.
Okay, yeah. So then you went into a corporate. Again, then it was more a kind of entrepreneurship process within a corporate, but also that was not successful.
No, that was actually so I finished my bachelor's and then directly joined the corporate.
Okay.
And during the bachelor's, I'd already started the project, the Connme.
Yeah.
And that went all along also while I was working full time and beyond, because at some point I quit that job and then was moving on. And so having had these two perspectives and both not really working out, I was really, let's say, questioning whether it's possible at all, or whether it's not just simply better to stick with the status quo.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, I was like, there are people out there, let's say the 1 out of 10, that for some reason have a perfect understanding of how it works and a replicable process, right? They not only founded one venture successfully, but 2, 3, 4. They do one thing, sell it, go to the next market, build again a successful thing. And I was like, that's fascinating. How did I do it? And so while still, let's say, digesting this failure in a way, I was becoming more and more obsessed with trying to understand how to do it properly.
Yeah.
And that really was what sparked a huge curiosity in me, which ultimately then led me to support as an advisor the Mapify founding team, who had started at the same time and learned a ton in the process. And then later also joined WHU for the master program to also get exposure to even more highly successful founders. And then joining Flink as well down the line to really work together with the founders, with serial founders, interviewing a ton of highly successful founders in my for my master thesis, and so on and so forth. So ever since, I'm really, let's say, keen on dissecting how that works.
Okay.
Because it kind of created an obsession about answering that question. What's the
And
secret sauce?
what is the magical ingredient? Did you come to an answer? What does make an entrepreneur successful?
I mean, I think there's various components to it, right? But like, at least speaking from what I found out in my thesis, is that it really has to do with a process which on literature sometimes is referred to deliberate practice, which you see in a lot of sports stars, right? If you picture the Michael Jordan or the Messi, they all dissect the skill set that they need into small, let's say, chunks that are digestible, and together with really high performing coaches, then say, okay, you have to perfect this particular skill in that manner, then set goals for this, train, get feedback, and they hone that particular skill till it's perfect, and then move on to the next one. And this is how they, let's say, create extreme excellence on a hard skill level. But then at the same time, and I think this is the often overlooked component, I think it has to do way more also with soft skills and with especially personal competences, and on the second basis also social competences. Because what all of the founders told me that I spoke to, and these were like people like Marco Vitor, founder of Audibene, or Patrick Andre, the founder of Home2Go, and so on and so forth. So really people that build huge companies. They all said it basically comes down to primarily having an understanding of yourself. Because if you understand yourself, you know exactly what you want to achieve. And you can also reflect way more on, are you on the right way? How do I have to adjust? And this then comes again with self-motivation, because if you know exactly what you want to achieve, then you're way more self-motivated. That translates also into resilience. And that's, let's say, the foundation for really going anywhere.
No.
And these founders, and right now a lot of people might say, okay, like this is something you can't train, like either you're born self-aware or not. But I would disagree, because putting yourself out there, same with developing this, let's say, ability to handle risks. If you put yourself out there and put yourself into risky environments, I mean, there's this concept which might be referred to as reality loop, where you're experienced your, let's say, physical reaction, and that creates another experiences, and so on and so forth. And so you can create particular where you can force your experience or the way you experience certain situations and create conclusions out of this, which then is the important part, creates belief patterns that influence again your perception of events. And so you can tweak that process for sure. Like you can, let's say, hack your mind. And again, it needs self-awareness, but putting yourself out in these situations, into high pressure environments, into environments where you get people to give you external feedback, where you have mentors that say, hey, this is the way I would do it. These are the skills you would need, also from a personal competence perspective. Later, also down the line for leadership, also hugely important if you want to build a big company. And then you can slowly start building that. But I think, like, aside from the hard skills, I think it's really about, let's say, starting at the foundation and understanding really yourself.
Okay. Because in 2021, you started a new company called Hatch, which is kind of an, I would say, consulting company that helps other companies with digital solutions. Can you explain me a bit how you have kind of used the learnings from your prior failures, let's say it like that, in the kind of setup of this new company? What have you done different based on the learnings from the past?
I mean, to start with the biggest learning, probably like the co-founder. Okay. I know right now, like the partner I founded Hatch with, we know each other right now since 8 years, but we sat down, like we met in an offsite meeting for 2 days and really completely transparently laid out what we want to do, what are our personal goals, how do we see a business evolving, and so on. Like, and we knew how the other person works, which I think is also hugely important up front. And then we laid out a clear co-founder agreement, which basically details, let's say, the ways of working and also the consequences of failing to adhere to these in order to prevent the situation I had early on with my co-founder. I think that's an important one. And I think that's the major realization that I had personally for myself. I think there's different ways to build businesses. There's, let's say, the classical way you alluded to that a lot of business students think about is like raising VC money and so on and so forth.
No.
But given that we were a bit scarred, so to speak, from not having enough resources, but at the same time still being willing to determine our own trajectory, we said, okay, let's build a business that is cash flow positive from day one. And so we focus firstly on creating services that companies will pay for.
No.
So that we could then, let's say, with those resources, grow without having to worry about how do we feed ourselves, because I think that's an important part, right?
Yeah.
If you're in a situation where you even have to worry about how am I going to pay rent next year or next month, then I think it doesn't put you in the right mindset to go out there and focus fully on your company. And so what we did is ultimately, and coming back to the learnings, because what we realized also coming back again to the corporate context, where I had experience and where we realized, hey, a lot of companies really struggle with this, just as I did back then. They want to create innovative solutions, but they either don't have the knowledge on how to do that. They don't even know which kind of market opportunity exists, or they simply don't have the current resources in terms of, for instance, developer power, or they really follow old style approaches. And so we said, hey, we're gonna create like such a product and venture studio that helps companies identify the right opportunities, but then also helps them to rapidly translate them into an MVP, but also, let's say, later on a full-scale product. And if they want, also have us being the persons through our network who bring the right co-founders on board. So basically doing like the classical venture building approach that's also other companies do, such as Bridgemaker and so on and so forth. But really iterating much more closely also to the corporates, like, and this is also something we're still learning, is really just picking up the phone, because either you learn or you make a sale. And I think just staying way more to the customer and avoiding like all this other things that Google suggests you. Basically, you have to be on LinkedIn, on Instagram, TikTok, and whatever channel at the same time.
Yeah.
You have to write blog posts, you have to go to conferences, and so on and so forth. Doing lots of these things and really just focusing on the essentials, which is creating business for the company, doing sales, and then all the rest, so to speak, falls into place at some point.
Yeah. No, but it's interesting that you emphasize this thing about having a kind of clear contract with your co-founder as your co-learning, because I think, or at least what I see in our network, is that still a lot of young, enthusiastic founders tend not to have that kind of contracts in place. It seems to be very difficult to do it. It's a bit like if you fall in love with your girlfriend or boyfriend, it seems to be difficult to immediately write a contract to kind of predict what you will do if it goes wrong.
Right.
And I think it's the same with a startup, not? Initially, you're enthusiastic, and then you might actually not be very tempted to write down all the potential scenarios that can go wrong. But as you seem to claim, you think it's quite important to do so.
I do think so, yeah, because it gives you, like, I think it also has to do with the fact of like anticipate risks. I mean, you can go overboard, right, and like completely get caught up in all these and analyzing so much that you're end up in complete paralysis state, right? But I think, let's say, crucial risks that can make or break the company, they should be addressed. And also, let's say, based on my internship experience with Cherry Ventures, for instance, where they also said, hey, like our founders should have a founder's contract, because it just creates a binding agreement, just as a purchasing contract does.
Yeah.
Where, of course, you can also just do, like, create a prototype for a company and say, yeah, once we're done, you're gonna pay us. But you also tend to have a contract where it clearly says, hey, those are the boundary conditions, so to speak, that you can fall back onto. So I think it just helps, and also for you personally to think through what are, let's say, the worst case scenarios that you can also prepare for, and that you clearly know this is behavior that I want to see, and this is behavior I don't want to see. I think it just gives a very good way of working together, just as you would have an employee contract later on, right? Where it also just states the basics. But yeah, again, and then I think on monetization, I think there was a huge learning for us that I described earlier, and simply really also understanding what is a pain point and what's a vitamin. I think those are really crucial elements that might be overlooked, where you say, yeah, I kind of know the market, I know myself, should be okay. And I mean, obviously, even as you keep iterating, you keep, let's say, refining the pain point, and you might actually go more niche at first to then go broader. Also, what we messed up, let's say, the first time around, we went too big too soon, or too vast. And if you go too vast, then you create a solution, but that solution is not really helpful for anyone. Rather focus on a very particular and like narrow target group, perfected for that. And then once they are like users that love your product, then you can see, okay, how can I expand it gradually?
Excellent, Kilian. Thanks for actually being willing to share a failure story that you have experienced. It's not always that straightforward to openly talk about that, so I really appreciate it. Now, before we end, we always have some questions at the end about what kind of books and playlists you want to recommend. But I also want to give you the opportunity to actually pitch your own podcast. Can you tell a bit more about the podcast that you have yourself?
Yes, gladly. So the Digital Transformer podcast is going to launch next week on the 12th of the 1st. And we invite both top-notch entrepreneurs as well as corporate executives who have built vastly successful companies, led huge transformations, and really interview them to find out how they did it. And focusing both on, let's say, the hard skills as well as the mindset behind it. And some of the guests that have joined us so far are the ex-CEO of Adidas Italy, Marco Viter, and other unicorn founders, and there are many more to come. And so, yeah, if you're curious about finding out, again, coming back to my experience and my obsession, how to build extremely successful digital businesses, then this podcast is for you. So yeah, you might find the link in the description below. It's Digital Transformer Podcast, or you just Google it on your preferred audio device platform.
Great. Now, and we will definitely add a link to it in the show notes so that people that are interested in it can access also your podcast. Any other suggestions in terms of other books, other podcasts that people should listen to?
A podcast that I really like as well is the Mike Dillard Show, which is from a US entrepreneur who's bootstrapped several businesses and turned them into multi-million-dollar revenue businesses. And I think his podcast has been listened over 1 million times, downloaded over 1 million times. It's a real gem. I've taken a lot out of it. And books, I think there are several that are great. What I personally, depending on the topic, right? But I think a must-have that I would have loved to read in the very early beginning is the Lean Startup. I think it would have taught me a lot about how to do things and how not to do things. But then also when it comes to networking, a hugely influential book for me was Never Eat Alone from Keith Ferrazzi.
Okay.
A book that really, let's say, details out how to network, how to get in touch with people, and to do it the right way. And the same author also has several other books. His recent one has been very helpful also when it comes to leadership. And yeah.
No, that's sounds like very interesting books. And of course, the Lean Startup approach is also a book that we heavily use at WHU to teach our students how to do it. So great that you also like it. Kilian, again, thanks a lot for being willing to share some of your failure stories. And I hope that also our audience enjoyed this. And we hope that we can welcome our audience again next time for a new episode of the Most Awesome Founder Podcast. Thanks for listening. Bye.
All right. Thanks for having me.